Welcome to On the Record, our deep dive into political stories making headlines both here in the Carolinas and across the country. I'm Chief Political Correspondent Andy Weber. Our topics today: a new push from lawmakers in Raleigh to redraw the state's congressional map, as well as the impact of Iryna's law that was recently passed by the General Assembly. And in South Carolina, a new push to further restrict abortion laws in the Palmetto State. We'll have interviews on all those topics, but first up, that push for a new congressional map in the Tar Heel State. We spoke with Catawba College professor Dr. Michael Bitzer about this new effort from state GOP leaders. Dr. Bitzer, I appreciate you joining us today on the record.
My pleasure.
So let's first start off with, have we seen the GOP in North Carolina before vote for a new map midway through a decade?
Well, typically, whenever we've seen this mid-decade redraw of the maps, it's usually due to a legal challenge. So in the past, North Carolina has had a very long history, going back to the 1980s, of maps being redrawn throughout decades and never having a complete set of maps, U.S. House, State Senate, survive one full decade. So we're long in terms of the experience of this, but we've never seen a kind of self-prompted dynamic that we're seeing now.
If you look at the current map, it's pretty carved up. So what part of the state do we expect them to go after or to target in this next newly drawn map?
Well, out of the 14 congressional districts, 13 of them are solidly for one party over the other. And I think where they're really going to be targeting, at least for this go around, is the upper northeastern portion of the state, and that is the 1st congressional district. That district tends to be slightly Democratic in terms of presidential voting patterns, but it is highly competitive. And by my analysis, if they carve some of the heavy Democratic precincts out, join them with a adjoining Republican district, and then push in some heavy Republican districts to the south of that particular district, that could easily move the 1st congressional district into a potential likely Republican seat, or at least competitive but lean Republican seat.
Midterms can always be a bit shaky if you go off the president's performance. But I'm curious, could this backfire on Republicans, or is the map drawn these days in a way that it's almost impossible to go the wrong way for them?
Well, it's certainly the case in North Carolina that our politics have hardened. We have become very rigid in our patterns. And what I've seen over time is really, if you use past election results, you have a pretty good correlation and relationship to future election results. Now, that isn't always necessarily the case, and there could be some dynamics at play that we don't know about a year out from the election. One of them, as you mentioned, is the presidential approval rating. We know that midterms become referendums on the president and his party, particularly if that party controls both chambers of Congress. People tend to move away from the president's party. The other factor to take into consideration, what is the economic environment going to be like? If people are sour on both the president and the economy, even with some, redrawing or reshaping of these congressional districts, if they fall within a competitive pattern, they could be vulnerable to some Democratic movement if they have an advantage going into the November 2026 midterm elections.
And from what we have discussed, voting or approving a new map is a pretty easy hill for the GOP to get over in this case.
Very much so. I mean, this is probably one of the easiest pieces of legislation. All they have to do is solidify a map, present it to both the State House and State Senate, and have a majority of both chambers vote for it. Currently, Republicans control a supermajority in the State Senate. They're one vote away in terms of the State House. And redistricting legislation does not go to the governor for approval. He cannot veto it. So this is probably the easiest piece of legislation that the Republicans will likely push through in this General Assembly.
So with that, it seems the only recourse would be a lawsuit. from any sort of party involved. That being said, would that lawsuit then tie the map up for a few years, or could the map still go into effect despite a lawsuit getting in the way?
Yeah, we've got experience in that question as well in North Carolina. Typically, what tends to happen is if a lawsuit is filed against it and it's likely going to be on racial grounds, the map would be allowed to be utilized during an election while the lawsuit is underway. And if they indeed pass this legislation, a new set of districts in a map sometime next week, so let's say within the next 2 weeks, candidate filing wouldn't occur until December for the March primary, but you would probably see the lawsuit filed. They would ask that the maps be put on hold. Generally, the courts tend to be ones of, we're not going to get involved in the electoral dynamics, so we'll let the map stay as is, but we will continue to allow the lawsuit to work its way through the courts.
All right, Professor Michael Bitzer, we'll leave it there. I appreciate your time.
Anytime.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. Last month, lawmakers in North Carolina passed Iryna's law following the murder of Iryna Zarutska on Charlotte's light rail. The bill had bipartisan support, despite having language that could allow for firing squads to be used for executions in North Carolina. The bill did have Democratic support. One of those lawmakers who voted for it was Mecklenburg County Democrat Laura Budd. She joined us in studio. Here's our conversation. We're now joined by State Representative Laura Budd. I appreciate you joining us in studio today for today's show.
Oh, thanks for having me. I like the new setup.
So let's first look back to what happened in late August, the murder of Iryna Zarutska. You represent Mecklenburg County. It happened on the Kent Blue Line.
Yeah.
Just your initial reaction to when that took place.
I remember when the murder happened. I remember seeing the headlines and reading about her, and my heart just broke for her and her family. Having fled the Ukraine, coming to the United States, she was so excited to do things like go get her driver's license and that sort of thing. And so it was a tragedy all the way around for her and her family. But then I also picked up on the fact that the assailant, DeCarlos Brown, was someone who was what we call a frequent flyer through the court system and had known mental health issues. And I thought, once again, someone has fallen through the cracks, and now we have a victim in the form of Iryna.
The video was released a few weeks after that. It became a national story, somewhat of a lightning rod politically. Did that surprise you to see that reaction and so much vitriol as well on top of that?
It didn't surprise me after the cat's video footage was leaked that it became this lightning rod, or that the White House and Donald Trump picked up on it. Not because I thought that they really cared, but because it was a play in their overall playbook to draw attention to a topic without actually doing anything substantively. And so, no, I was not surprised, and nor was I surprised to see the North Carolina Republicans jump on board as well.
So let's stop right there. Did you think that a response after that from the General Assembly, through legislation, through a committee meeting, was that the right way to go? Would it start in Raleigh, or would it start somewhere else, you think?
Well, it should have started a lot earlier. It should have started over a decade ago with regards to public funding for public safety initiatives, community policing initiatives, crisis assistance responder units. We have some with CMPD. We need a lot more. It should have started with mental health funding, psych evals, not just the evaluation, but how do we treat, or do we place in a state hospital those who are not willing to undergo and stay with treatment, or are just dangerous to themselves or in society. So I don't know that legislation wasn't the answer when this happened, but I do know that we could have done so much more over 10 years ago. And if we had done that, this would not have happened to Iryna Zarutska and her family.
So legislature, the Republican legislature, they drafted this bill, Iryna's law.
Yeah.
You saw it, you read it. Before that vote, what did you make of that legislation?
Woefully inadequate. It was a knee-jerk reaction, not a thoughtful response to what had transpired. And the biggest thing is, while I voted for it, there were things I didn't like about it. Number one was, in fact, there's no money in it. I sent a letter to the speaker, Dustin Hall, and I said, hey, here are 5 things. This is before the legislation rolled out. Here are 5 things that you need to consider. And one of them was funding for an additional 5,000 police officers across the state of North Carolina for the municipalities that are in need of them, like the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. They have on average 200 to 300 vacancies. We could certainly use more boots on the ground. But combined with that was 5,000 crisis assistance response units as well. And what those people do is they attempt to go along with the law enforcement when calls come in that are mental health related or that arise during the course of a call. And they're intervention experts in the mental health field. And studies have shown officers are 16 times less likely to pull their weapon when, in fact, someone from a crisis intervention, crisis assistance team is with them. Because law enforcement, as good as they are and as well-intentioned as they are, simply don't have the mental health training that someone who does crisis assistance does.
There was a portion in there that dealt with the death penalty.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, we know the current method of execution is held up in the courts over a legal battle. This would have allowed for firing squads to be a possible method if the current method was deemed unconstitutional, if I'm not mistaken. That being said, voting for it, do you have a concern that your vote could lead to bringing that method of execution into practice in North Carolina?
Well, the Eighth Amendment may be one of the last standing amendments to the U.S. Constitution, and that is the prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. And so while I think that the death penalty provision should never have been included in it, I am opposed to the death penalty. I also think that the president of the Senate, Phil Berger, I likened his conduct throwing that amendment in at the last minute about firing squads was simply his way of throwing off attention to the fact that he has got a very bitter fight primary up in his district. And it's just simply a smokescreen. And he's hoping that by the time the smoke clears, nobody will have noticed what he did. But I do have concerns about the death penalty being restarted, but I have faith that the courts are going to sort this out and they will make the right decision. But I am opposed to it, and I think it ought to be abolished.
But do you believe the governor has the tools? Because he signed it himself, and he mentioned it will not happen under his tenure to have firing squads. Do you believe he has the tools to stop it, even though he signed it?
Yes, I do believe that Governor Stein has the ability to halt such cruel and unusual punishment as firing squads or electrocution and that sort of thing. And a lot of that has to do with we have some really good people in office as the governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general. And we also have a very purple state, which you oftentimes can't see because we're so gerrymandered on the state legislative level. But the reality is I don't think North Carolinians support the death penalty, certainly not what Senator Berger decided to try and put through in this legislation.
So obviously we had this tragedy that happened on the Blue Line.
Mm-hmm.
In your mind, is Charlotte a dangerous city?
No, it's not dangerous, but it is a big city. It's the biggest in the state of North Carolina. We're constantly fighting with Raleigh for population, who has the biggest population. It's an economic powerhouse. It has over 1 million people in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg metropolitan area. And you are going to have more crime per capita as a result. But I think the way to address that is some of what CMPD is doing, which they put out the other day with paying more attention to the small things. I think you'd mentioned the entertainment district being more heavily policed as the bars are letting out, that sort of thing. Those are real world solutions looking at the actual issues confronting Charlotteans. But overall, the city is safe, but we do need more assistance from the state and the federal government. Under President Trump, we've had over $100 million cut in public safety initiatives across the nation. So he cannot, out of one side of the mouth, say, blue cities are crime-ridden and we need to send in the National Guard. And out the other side of his mouth, busily stroke away hundreds of millions of dollars that would go to public safety initiatives that would, in fact, help all of us be safe, not just in Charlotte, but across the state of North Carolina as well.
It did seem that on the city council, one thing they agreed on was that there was parts missing from this bill to help the city fight crime. One of that was enough DAs in Met County.
That's true.
There's 10 more under this bill. Yesterday, the DA said I could have used 60 more district attorneys in my office.
Wake County could probably use another 80 more. We are woefully understaffed in DA offices. But also remember that you have the right to an attorney if you are indigent and accused of a crime. And so while the 10 ADAs and staff are a good start, it's not nearly enough. DA Merriweather is correct about that. But we also need more assistant public defenders, and we need to improve the pay with them as well. Because you can have all the DAs in the world, but if you don't have criminal defense attorneys, we're not having trials. And you've got to have both. And that also comes with more court staff and more sheriffs, deputy sheriffs for the jails. All of those parts and pieces. It's easy to focus on the prosecutorial side and forget the defense side, but the system doesn't work without all of the components filled.
We've touched on so many possible solutions because it is such a large issue.
Huge.
It's a complex issue. That being said, where should the General Assembly focus next when it comes to, if not increasing the perception of safety, just addressing the issue overall statewide?
Well, I think I'm known for somebody who doesn't particularly care for lip service. I would rather see practical solutions implemented and the funding to accompany them to make sure that they're executed in full. But I also believe in measuring. What gets measured gets improved. So I think we need to have metrics by which we measure things as well. I would say, in addition to ADA funding and more officers and crisis intervention, crisis assistance folks on the streets, we also need to look at the mental health side of it. And this is not to diminish the brutality of the murder of Iryna Zarutska, but let's be honest. There are people who are severely mentally ill. They are either undiagnosed and untreated or perhaps diagnosed and untreated. And while they may not be dangerous at some point or a large part of their lives to themselves or others, there may come a time when they are. And what we have not done as a society is say, how do we help those people? Nobody's 5 and says, I can't wait to grow up and live on the street. Nobody's born and says, I can't wait to have a mental illness. So if we're really going to address the issues, we're going to have to look 360. The psych evals that are part of Iryna's law are only a piece of the psych evals. The shooting in Southport not too long ago in Brunswick County is evidence that it cannot be limited to the criminal system for the mental health evaluations. That was a person, was a VA vet, was severely mentally ill. His mother and his best friend had routinely told the courts, hey, he's dangerous, he's severely mentally ill, and he has firearms, you need to take them away. We need a red flag law that would have enabled the courts to take those away. Also, when he committed that murder, there had been a civil case that had just been dismissed that he had filed. And it was clear in that case that the man suffered from mental illness, but the superior court judge didn't have the tools that he needed in order to start the process to either remove the firearms, i.e. a red flag law, or to start the involuntary commitment proceedings with a mental health evaluation. So that's why I called the legislation 307 a knee-jerk reaction and not a thoughtful response, because they forgot people coming through the court system may also be coming through the civil system. And when you come through the civil side, it just doesn't get the same attention that it would in the criminal side. But we need to pay attention to both.
I wish we had more time. We'll have to leave it there. State Rep Laura Budd, thanks for joining us in studio today.
Thank you for having me.
This month, lawmakers in Columbia heard a bill that restricts abortion even further in South Carolina. One of the reporters tracking that bill very closely is Nick Reynolds with the Post and Courier. He now joins us on the record. Nick, thanks for being here.
Good to be with you.
So let's first get more into this bill. Explain what it is. I believe it's Senate Bill 323, if I'm not mistaken. What does this bill do?
So this bill is more or less a full-on criminalization of abortion. It regulates just about every area of this, from a new definition of fertilization in state law to even what some people believe could potentially be a limit on just everyday contraceptives that you might get over the counter. It's much stricter than some of the laws we've already had in place. The state already has a 6-week ban on abortion, which at 6 weeks of pregnancy, most women don't already know they're pregnant. So it is a de facto ban on the books already here. And this one goes a step further. It's being backed by some of the most ardent supporters of anti-abortion legislation in the South Carolina legislature. And it's already proving quite controversial down here in Columbia.
Now, I do see there was a part of the bill that would ban emergency contraception. Is that the first bill that you're aware of, or at least, I guess, if it were to become law, the first law in the country that would ban emergency contraception, or as some call it, Plan B?
I know this has been floated in other states before. I'm not sure fully of whether the similar bills have gotten a hearing before, but if enacted, this would be the most conservative anti-abortion legislation in the country. It does name Plan B, as you mentioned. That's one of the very, very explicit aims of this. But another facet of this that is really making some people reluctant to support it is the provisions around the mitigating circumstances that would allow an abortion, like in instances of to save the life of the mother, because there's no exceptions in this bill for rape or incest, right? But another key provision of this, and this is one that got only a little bit of attention, among the other provisions of the bill, was that it does require written consent for any person under the age of 18 to receive one of these emergency mitigations, if you will, to the point where they would have actually have to, get the consent of a legal guardian under the age of 18 to receive a life-saving abortion. And given the fact that there are no exceptions for rape or incest, some people raise the scenario where they might even need to get the parental permission of their own abuser in order to obtain this life-saving care.
So this bill was heard in committee in Colombia. What was the point of the hearing?
So it was raised by a former state senator, and no one would really confirm this on the record, but you vote for a certain piece of legislation, and there's usually like a promise that a piece of legislation that might not have gotten momentum in the past would get a hearing in exchange for someone's vote. This was heavily insinuated during the hearing. I know there's been talk around Colombia to this effect as well. For the main part, that mainstream conservatives here really don't support the criminal provisions in this. It's already driven a major rift in some of the anti-abortion organizations in the state. They seem more or less divided over whether this is actually workable. The governor of South Carolina has already weighed in, saying that he believes that the law that's in place right now is just fine the way it is. And we've even heard from members of legislative leadership, especially heading into an election year, this is not a topic they really want to be touching right now.
All that being said, there still was a rather tense hearing. Opponents of the law, as your reporting said, were quite upset with it. Are they concerned it might open the door to it coming back down the line?
And that's a good question. There was an indication at the end of the hearing that there will be another subcommittee hearing. It's rather unclear, how the actual votes are going to split as to whether to get this to a full health committee. While the primary, Health and Human Services Committee we have down here would be more, the chair is, more prone to support anti-abortion legislation than he is not. But the vote count is, somewhat unknown at the subcommittee level on whether this will actually be able to make it to the full committee. And then assuming it does make it out of the full committee, which, that could be tough. They'd still have to, force a vote on this ultimately. And, people would, need to be coerced to not weasel their way out of the vote for the vote to happen. It would still have to go to the floor. And even then, there's a million different mechanisms you can use to make sure that something never actually gets a hearing on the floor. I mean, the calendar is generally run by the House Majority Floor Leader, who's been in that position for quite some time. Has not really shown any indication that he's set to lose that power. And even then, it would still have to go to the House, where a very similar bill that even has the support of the Speaker of the House with criminal penalties for women who get abortions has failed to get a hearing on that side of the building. So there remains the question of whether the House would even be willing to take this up. And considering that we're in the second year of a 2-year session, and there is legislation like on other important topics like roads that still need to be discussed, like that's going to be a really huge conversation this legislative session. You could argue that it's a long shot that this would actually get a real serious hearing on the floor.
And lastly, you mentioned the current laws on the books. A 6-week ban, I believe it's many viewed as a heartbeat ban. Abortion essentially is banned outright in the state. That being said, is there any form of access currently? Why restrict it even further? I assume that's why some Republicans and pro-life groups are against this legislation.
Yeah, and we've still had some issues with that already here. I mean, a big topic has been the ongoing issues stemming from court decisions regulating the use of Medicaid for organizations like Planned Parenthood. That's already impacting their compensation method. While they are able to perform some functions, Planned Parenthood is essentially limited in what they can ultimately do. And so you mostly have, private organizations like, there's, one abortion fund, I believe it's just, the Palmetto Abortion Fund that has been, funding people to go out of state. That's been occurring too. We don't really have specific numbers per se as to how many people are doing that, but, we do know it is a pretty significant sum. And they've been taking in quite a bit of money since the 6-week ban came down.
And lastly, you mentioned that there isn't much support for it, but for it to progress in this process of lawmaking, what would have to happen next for it to reach a floor vote in either chamber?
Yeah, so we're incredibly far from that process right now. We have a roughly 5-month session. It runs from January into June. We still have to pass a budget every year. That's one of the biggest priorities that we have. And, really you need to get through several rounds of voting to actually, make this happen. So you'd have to get through the subcommittee level. It's currently working its way through the subcommittee right now. After it gets voted out of the subcommittee, assuming it does, we don't know that they have the votes to do. It would then go to the full committee, after which, if they vote that out, it goes to the floor. It has to go through 3 rounds of voting. If history is any indication, this is going to take up at least a week, maybe 2 weeks of floor time that they could be committing to a number of other bills. Once it gets through the Senate, it goes through the exact same process over on the House side. And that is arguably a much more arduous than the Senate typically is. But we've been surprised before. We'll see.
All right, Nick Reynolds with the Post and Courier. I appreciate you joining us. Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Good talking to you. Thanks to Nick Reynolds from the Post and Courier, Professor Michael Bitzer from Catawba College, as well as State Rep Laura Budd for joining us on the record. I'm Chief Political Correspondent Andy Weber. We'll see you next time.
Queen City News Plus. Just search Queen City News on your smart TV's app store.